Part 10. 48. 6 dawns in a row, a new soul glimmered on a branch of the old tree, only to fade in the strong light of the day. Prim, looking out the window in the hour before dawn, could see it there. It looked like a star softened by drifting fog and mist. Even after the light of day had extinguished it, she could, by moving about on the grass beneath, make herself see the faint distortion that the soul was creating in the air. On the 7th morning it seemed to discard all hopes and intentions of ever making light of its own, and darkened and solidified into the form of a blackbird. This perched on the branch for some days, seeming dead except that it would shift its footing from time to time when strong winds came down from the mountains. When gusts ruffled its feathers, it would open its wings just enough to learn a few things about how they worked, then fold them tight against its body, and close its eyes for a while. Blossoms flourished on a few branches of the ancient tree that was still capable of bearing apples. By the time these had withered and blown away, the blackbird was fully formed and capable of flight, though not very good at it. Prim woke up one morning and looked out her window to find the branch vacant, the bird nowhere to be seen. She felt a pang of loss. But then the still air of dawn was fractured by a clattering of black feathers and a scraping of talons on the stone sill of her window. She leapt back. The bird perched on the window frame and gazed at her curiously. "I am Corvus," it announced. "And I am not like other new souls who come into the land, though I cannot remember why." "Oh, of that there is no doubt," said Prim, for she had never heard tell of a new soul who had adopted a form and acquired the power of speech so readily. Indeed, had Corvus so manifested in other parts of the land, he'd have been done away with by the superstitious folk who dwelled in such parts. That he had come into being in a tree in the garden of the Caledons was lucky, for the Caledons were queer folk. "My name is Prim," she said. "My family is Caledon. This is Cala." "What do those words mean? Prim? Caledon?" "Oh, they are not those kinds of words," she answered. "You see, some words are very old, and their significance forgotten." "So Caledons have been here for a long time?" She nodded. "We built this house on the back of a sleeping giant at the dawn of the Third Age, if that helps you." "It doesn't." This Corvus seemed quite difficult to please. She shrugged. "That is our garden, and this is my bedchamber. I have been watching you." "I know," said Corvus, not really making it clear how many of the assertions just made by Prim had been known to him. No matter, the bird looked her up and down. She was wearing a sleeping gown that fell all the way to the floor. "Are you a girl or a woman?" "Girl," Prim told him. "Of how many falls?" "It is not what matters," she told him. "Caledons are queer folk. Girls become women or boys become men when some occasion requires it. Of late this part of the land has been quiet, and such occasions few." "I require a small party of women and men to accompany me on a quest, and lend a hand in its culmination," Corvus stated. "What manner of quest?" Corvus seemed not to have considered this seemingly basic question. He pondered it for a few moments, then rearranged his wings in a birdy shrug. "Travel? Searching? Digging something up? I don't know. Very important. Leave immediately." "May I have breakfast?" she asked. When Corvus seemed taken aback, she explained, "Others will be there who might help, and in any case it would never do for one of my family to enter womanhood and embark on a quest without at least saying a few words." Corvus shrugged his wings and said he would wait in the tree. He hopped around to reverse his direction and took to the air with a lot more clattering and whacking than was typical of more experienced birds, and found his way after some misadventures back to his old perch. There he bided as various hints and clues emerged from the house. Chimney smoke, sounds of dish utensil collisions, opening and closing of doors and window shutters, and rising and falling murmurs of conversation. The house in some places was made of stones piled atop other stones, in others of wood. In some parts of it the weather was kept out by sheaves of grass cleverly bound together. in others by sheets of gray metal or splits of thin rock. It looked, in other words, as if bits had been added on to other bits over a long span of time, without any very clear plan, extending this way and that to enclose little yards such as the one where the apple tree grew. No part of it was especially high or grand, with the possible exception of the one that seemed to be making the greatest amount of smoke and noise during the activity that Prim had denominated breakfast. This was a hall with a rectangular plan and a lofty peaked roof, with windows just under the eaves, high enough to admit light and air. After a while, people came out of it, following Prim, who had tied her hair back and put on more clothes. They were all of the same form. Most were taller than Prim, but a few were tiny, and some even had to be carried around by larger ones. They passed through a sort of arch that communicated with the yard and formed up in an arc centered on Corvus. "Let's go," Corvus said, and spread his wings to take flight. "Just a moment, if you would," said a man with hair growing out of his face and extending down onto his chest. "We Caledons are no strangers to quests. And in fact, if you were to fly into our hall over yonder, you would see pictures on the walls of our ancestors engaged in some as recently as 100 falls ago. So it cannot be said that you have come to the wrong place altogether. But before you make off with our Prim, we would like to know one or two things about just what it is you have in mind, such as, which direction are you going?" "I had given very little thought to it," said Corvus. "Well, you see, that does concern me a little," said the man. "For some directions are more hazardous than others, and if you should happen to pick the wrong one, why, you will only get farther away from your destination with each beat of your wings." Corvus meditated upon these words. "Very well," he said. "I'll be back." He began to flap his wings, but had some difficulty getting clear of the apple tree's impossibly gnarled branches. "There is carrion out back of the kitchen," said a younger man with hair on his upper lip. "It might give you greater strength if you ate some." Standing next to that man was a woman with yellow hair. "And the greater your strength, the farther you can fly. From here," she added helpfully. "If you go south or east," said Prim, "stay high, because of arrows. North or west, low. Eagles," added the man who had spoken first. Thus advised, Corvus worked free of the tree's grasp and flew over behind the hall to a little yard where someone was tossing food out of an open door onto the ground. There it was being fought over by various low-to-the-ground creatures. Wanting no part in their squabbles, Corvus flew in through the door and found a piece of a dead animal lying on a slab of wood. He picked this up in his talons. The woman who had been throwing the food took exception and hurled a metal container at him, but it did not strike him, so he flew into the hall carrying the piece of the dead animal and went up to a high, exposed piece of dead tree that seemed to be playing a part in holding the roof up. There he bided for a while, tearing the carrion into shreds small enough to swallow. As had been promised, the building's walls, below the windows, were adorned with images. Some were made by the weaving together of colored fiber, others by applying colored stuff to flat things. At first, these made little sense to him, but as his stomach filled with carrion, his powers of understanding grew, and he saw that all of these were ways of tricking the eye to make it see things that were not actually present. Apparently the figures shown were Caledons, or at least some of them were. The handsome ones astride four-legged beasts, probably Caledons. The ugly, misshapen ones they were depicted as killing, probably something else. Prim had made passing reference to a giant who was asleep. It could be guessed that the very large biped made of rocks, prominently featured in one of the larger pictures, was the very same, though during the events shown most definitely awake. Stringing all of these pictures together into a story looked to be an all-day project, but Corvus didn't have to go to all that trouble to get the drift. Caledons and other such-like persons had come here a long time ago as part of an epic adventure featuring not only giants but floods, avalanches, packs of ravening beasts, flying bipeds with bright swords, and diverse other entities that did not look much like them. Strange-looking cities had been visited, caught on fire, fled. This had at some point given way to a more settled way of life, in circumstances that were nicer but, on the whole, colder. Crops and orchards had been planted, animals husbanded, babies made, buildings raised. Efforts, apparently successful, had been made to defend all of that through the systematic application of violence. These doings accounted for most of the pictures. But there were a few that did not fit into that general scheme, in which extraordinarily good-looking individuals, at a guess, Caledons, went to outlandish places to fight odd-looking critters and or collect peculiar objects, which confirmed in the mind of Corvus that these queer folk would make adequate quest material. Thus nourished with an agreeable breakfast of carrion and historical imagery, Corvus flew out through an open window and soared high into the air above the hill on which the Caledons had built their house. The place was shrouded in mist and cloud, but once he had flown for some distance and ascended to a greater height, he turned into the east and saw the land stretched out before him. He was back a year later. "My notions have firmed up," he announced. "I know roughly where to go, and several ways to get there, and why some of those ways are preferable to others, what your mount eats and how much it costs, how far arrows fly, why certain kinds of people automatically try to kill you. All this and more is known to me. Let us be on our way." A lengthy silence ensued. No one got up. The Caledons were seated at a long table out of doors, in a courtyard next to the hall, whence food and drink were being brought out to them by persons whom Corvus now understood to be servants. Some of them Corvus recognized from a year ago, others were visitors, as could be guessed from the tired mounts and dusty carts scattered about the premises. The man with the beard was seated at one end of the table. Corvus had learned that his name was Brindle Caledon. At the opposite end, facing Brindle, was a woman who seemed to be the most senior and respected of the visitors. She was called Perilonda Bufrecht. Along the sides of the table, Caledons and Bufrechts were commingled. Corvus had perched on a sort of wrought iron tree erected in the middle of the table to support many candles. None of these had been lit yet because the sun had not finished going down. Diners seated near it had scooted back as he had come in for a landing, and some had gripped their eating knives in a not altogether welcoming style, reminding Corvus that he had grown into what was probably the largest raven any of them had ever seen. "That is the largest raven I have ever seen," said one of the visitors. "I found tremendous size useful," Corvus explained, "when traversing eagle country." "And it talks," said another, which to Corvus seemed as if it ought to have been fairly obvious by now. But Corvus was aware of his own limitations. He had roamed over much of the land and knew more of it than any of these persons possibly could. But he had been to almost no dinner parties, and so was ignorant of practices. Perhaps saying incredibly obvious things was customary. "I am an enormous, sentient, talking raven who has just interrupted your dinner party and shat on the centerpiece," observed a woman sitting nearby. "And my name is—" "Corvus!" exclaimed a woman seated down at the end near Brindle. It was Prim. Corvus had not recognized her immediately, for her form and dress had altered during his absence. She stood up and clasped her hands together. "As you can see, I am more nearly ready to take part in the quest now than when you last saw me. I've grown bigger and stronger and learned map reading and riding and archery and other things as well." Corvus clucked approvingly. But in truth Prim was the least of his concerns, for he had always somehow known that she would turn out fine. He was distracted by the sheer variety of reactions that his arrival had elicited from the guests. A surprisingly large number of them, more so among the visitors than the Caledons, seemed never to have encountered a sentient, talking animal in their whole lives. Those could be divided among those who had considered such a thing impossible, and who still persisted in thinking so and were therefore doubting the evidence of their senses, because of too much drink taken, or adulterants in the food, deliberately and maliciously introduced or put in by accident, or because it was all a dream. Those who believed that such creatures had existed long ago but were strictly things of the past, subdivided into those doubting the evidence of their senses, as before, those who found the sudden arrival of a fairy-tale creature fascinating and charming, or evil, loathsome, dire. Those who had known all along that such creatures existed, and who were not greatly surprised to encounter one at dinner, divided into one who rather liked him, Prim, those calmly reserving judgment, for example, Brindle, those who hated him, the yellow-haired woman, and the man with the hair on his upper lip. At any rate, the total number of persons at the table was not enormously larger than the number of categories, meaning that nearly everyone present was reacting in an altogether different way, and in most cases doing so rather strongly, leading to a pandemonium of fainting, screaming, knife-waving, malicious glaring, furious remonstration, hand-clapping delight, dismay, judicious beard-stroking, etc., to say nothing of secondary interactions, as when a knife-waver collided with a screamer. Corvus, accustomed to soaring alone, found himself frankly quite overwhelmed, and thought it best to fly away. He did not go off to any great remove, but, from their point of view, probably vanished into the darkening sky, touching off a resurgence of the doubting the evidence of their own senses crowd. The dinner seemed to have been terminated. At least half of them went into the hall, many pausing on the threshold to cast suspicious looks over their shoulders. But when it seemed things had settled down, Corvus descended and perched on the back of a chair that had been vacated. Still present were Brindle, Prim, Paralonda, though she had taken advantage of the upset to pick up her goblet and move closer, and half a dozen or so mixed Caledons and Bufrects. The latter seemed generally in the astonished but agreeably fascinated camp, whereas Caledons, being queer folk, seemed more likely to view talking animals as part of the natural order of things. This was the moment when a human would have apologized for having ruined the dinner parties, but one of the liberties that went along with being a raven was never being sorry for anything. "Can you say anything more about the nature of your quest?" asked Brindle. "You mentioned that you knew which direction to go in, and that is certainly an improvement upon how matters stood a year ago. But what do you expect to find at Journey's End? And what do you envision doing once you have found it?" While Corvus was thinking about this, and to be quite honest, he was thinking about it for the first time ever, the man with the hair on his lip and the woman with the yellow hair emerged from the hall. They moved with more haste than grace in a straight line for Prim. "Merville," said Brenda. "Philora, would you care to sit with us? There is no lack of empty chairs." But it seemed that Merville and Philora preferred standing behind Brindle and Prim to sitting just a tiny bit farther away. "What I don't get is this," Merville announced. "This creature is quite obviously capable of flight, which we are not. It can go anywhere it pleases, any time it chooses. Why, then, does it not simply go to wherever this quest is to be culminated or whatever, and do whatever needs doing?" After a short pause, Philora spoke. "I'll tell you why not. It must be that the completion of the quest requires humans. The raven can't get it done without us, and what are humans good at that ravens are not? Well, fighting and all that goes with it in the way of getting hurt and maimed and dying and so on." And she rested a hand on Prim's shoulder. This made Prim twitch, but she did just manage to control an impulse to shrug or slap Philora's hand away. "Huge talking ravens actually can fight," Corvus pointed out, "and I have scars to prove it." "And this is supposed to reassure us?" asked Merville in an incredulous tone. "I can't shake the notion that the quest will somehow involve going underground," Corvus said, "or, at any rate, into some sort of structure so deep and convoluted that it might as well be underground, and perhaps that is why I have been absolutely certain from the beginning that humans must be part of it." "Again," said Merville, "if the intent of these statements is to reassure us as to the nature of the planned activities, or for that matter whether you have even the vaguest notion as to what those activities are to consist of, then you might wish to fly away again and Stay away for a good deal longer, and come back with a plan. Or, better yet, find some other family to pester, put in Philora. I have pestered several. Yours is best, said Corvus. Look, the nature of the quest far transcends ordinary concerns of day-to-day existence, such as eating, drinking, staying warm, and not getting maimed or whatever. It has to do with the fundamental nature of reality, the land of whose existence your mind convinces you from one moment to the next whenever you are awake. People who actually bother to think about this, which is, as far as I can tell, not very many of them, come up with various overarching stories about it that seem more or less convincing depending on what strikes one's fancy story-wise. Just ask anyone you meet what they believe about El, Egdod, and all that. For my own part, I know it to be the case that I came into this world under unusual circumstances and with certain powers, instincts, and predispositions already built in. That cannot be denied, even if I lack clear memories as to how it came about. I think it reasonable to assume that I was sent hither on a one-way trip from another plane of existence whose exact nature will forever remain mysterious to us. But the powers of that world know about us and care about us, and have plans, or at least hopes, for us. And it is their desire and their intention that we should come into possession of certain knowledge that will give us power to affect the land for the better. The nature of that knowledge is mysterious, but it awaits us at the end of the quest. Even if going there and getting it were within the powers of a solitary giant talking raven, which I do not believe to be the case, doing so would be beside the point, since the quest's purpose, as preordained by the mysterious powers in the world from which I was sent, is not just to make everything perfect for one raven, but rather to effect a transformation in your souls. We leave at first light. Rather a lot of arguing and discussion ensued, very little of which seemed to require the presence or participation of Corvus, who in any case had already told these people everything he knew. People came and went between this outdoor table and the hall in greater or lesser states of furor. As they did, Corvus hopped sideways from chairback to chairback until he was almost down to the far end. Then he flew off into the night and soon found a comfortable perch on a tree branch near the hall. From it he was able to see through open windows to the interior, which was lit up by burning things. He reviewed the tapestries and paintings that he had seen a year ago. These made more sense now that he had actually been to some of the places depicted, albeit not very realistically, and laid eyes on some of the categories of souls shown. One item had made no sense at all to him when he had first seen it, but now he understood what it was. This was ostensibly a painting of a very large tree, but curiously bedizened with little pictures of people who appeared to be attached to its branches like apples. The pictures were labeled with words. He now knew how to read these, because he had visited the tower of the ink grinders in the fair city of Toravithronax, and perched in the window of the high atelier where Pessil herself taught her students the 3 runic and the 11 scribal alphabets, as well as 2 completely different and incompatible systems of writing said to be used by strange people in the teemings of the Far East. 2 different alphabets from 3 discernible epochs were represented among the names on this tree. Reclining naked against the tree's trunk were a man and a woman labeled in very old script as Adam and Eve. Below them, shown underground, were roots labeled Egdod and Spring. Other queer old names such as Ward and Longregard were scattered about on other rootlets. Thingor and Knotweave toiled in little subterranean cavelets, making things. Above them, standing on the ground to one side of the tree and bathing everything in white light, was El. Scattered about was an assortment of souls. To El's side of the tree, winged angels, and mounted autochthons, and hunched scuttling beetles. To the other side, bipedal rock piles, animated whirlwinds, and other oddments. Low down, the trunk of the tree pushed out an ungainly side branch that looked as if it really ought to have been pruned off for starters. Chiseled into its bark in one of the runic alphabets were the number 12 and a word that meant something like great ones or perhaps giants. It forked in 2, Its lower fork had 6 branches all labeled with names that sounded masculine, and its upper fork 6 that were more feminine-seeming. The former were all dead ends, but the latter produced various sub-branches. Meanwhile, the tree's main trunk went straight up for a bit, throwing out 8 major side boughs. The 8 boughs likewise sported an even mix of male and female names, and most of them forked and reforked profusely, so that the total number of little branches, out at the periphery, must have numbered in the hundreds, if not thousands. But unlike a real tree, this one included countless places where twigs from different branches came back together. To Corvus of a year ago this had made no sense, as real tree branches never did this. But he now understood that this was not a tree. It was a way of explaining how the descendants of Adam and Eve had recombined to populate the land. And so, in a case where, for example, the second son of Adam and Eve had mated with their third daughter to produce a child, it was necessary for those branches to bend together and merge in a distinctly non-tree-like manner. More than 2 or 3 generations along, these had become impossible for the artists to keep doing, and so beyond that point they had resorted to drawing lines between widely separated branches, or simply duplicating names. This did not make the tree any easier to make sense of. Once Corvus got the overall gist of it, he began to feel that the more he stared at it, the less he knew. But one good big patch of it was labeled People Beyond the First Shiver, and right in the middle of that was Caledon, and not far away was Bufrecht, which Corvus gathered was the family name shared by most of the visitors. In relatively clean, fresh paint, Brindle was assigned a leaf of his own, but no one seemed to have got round to filling in any more recent arrivals. Likewise, the most recent addition to the Bufrecht family was Paralonda, which was the name of the lady who had been seated at the other end of the table from Brindle. Corvus was tired and desirous of sleep, but before his eyes closed, he devoted some effort to tracing the branches backward from Brindle and Paralonda, working his way down the tree. Finally, he traced the connection he was searching for, all the way back to the root, and then traced it back outward again, confirming that it led to the people who had built this hall. Then his eyes closed, and he slept, lulled by the dull roar of arguing sprung. For in most of the land, that was the term for souls who were descended from Adam and Eve. Quests are a thing that we do. It is a point of pride with us, in fact, Brindle told him a week later. They had attained the high point of a pass through the mountains. Weather was good for a change, though on Kala, this only meant that the clouds were higher than the tops of the mountains. So, at the suggestion of Corvus, Brindle had scrambled up to the summit of a nearby peak, whence a better view could be had. Much of this bit, as islands were called in this part of the world, could be surveyed from here. Directly below them was the stopping place where the other members of the party were resting their legs, drying out their clothes, and making tea over a little fire. Looking to the south, they could see the winding valley up which they had been toiling for the last several days. Somewhat hazed over in the greater distance was the rolling green country where the Caledon's house stood. Turning about and looking then to the north, they could see another ridge, and another one after that. Brindle knew from maps, and Corvus knew from actually having been there, that those eventually gave way and dropped into a green valley where the going would be easier, all the way down to the sea. Brindle went on. Some people, however, would have gone around the mountains instead of directly through them. I wonder if your ability to fly might have impaired your judgment as regards route finding. There is a road, Corvus pointed out. We have been following it. At its best. When it is traversing a well-drained meadow, for example, it is better described as a path or trail. At its more frequently seen worst, on the other hand, it all connects up. I have followed it from one end of this bit to the other. There is also a road, a true road, that circumvents the mountains on their eastern flank. And the Bufrechts have ships that could take us up the western coast. Oh, I'm not complaining, yet. As I said, we are questing folk, and this feels quite a bit more quest-like than lounging on the deck of some boat. But if you don't mind, how many quests have you performed? Corvus asked. Brindle sighed. When I was a boy, I sailed across the first shiver to the mainland, and rode with my father from our house to the ford of the river Thos, a journey of several days. There I bade him farewell, never to see him again, though of course I did not know that at the time. Then I went home. There were wolves, and a scuffle with some rough characters. He glanced in the direction of a heaving mound of skins and furs with a spear next to it. Somewhere under that was a rough character named Burr. And? That is all. No quests for you, other than that. That is correct. So when you say, Brindle, that you are questing folk, I am saying that that is how we define ourselves. The tales we tell, the pictures we hang on the wall. But it has been a long time since any Caledon has taken part in a quest worthy of being so called. This has weighed on my mind for many years. I am trying to tell you, Corvus, that I consented to place myself and my friends and family at hazard, not so much because I find you convincing, but because the mere fact of going on a quest is its own reward. And so cutting directly across the mountainous center of Cala, instead of scurrying around the edge, isn't the worst thing in the world. But if you continue to make perverse choices in route finding, and we in consequence run out of food or get hurt, questions will begin to be raised. And at that point I shall need to have a better answer than, oh, going on quests builds character. And you shall have to have something better than strange talk about the fundamental nature of reality and how you fancy you were sent here from some other plane of existence that you cannot actually remember. Well, the way we are taught it is this, Prim was saying. It could be guessed from the looks on the others' faces and from subtleties about their posture that some sort of disagreement had arisen while Brindle and Corvus had been up above. The glance that Prim now threw Brindle's way as much as proved it. He had been enlisted on her side of a dispute he knew nothing of. The topic seemed to be an old map that had been unrolled and spread flat to dry. They carried their maps in a tube that had got soaked by the rains, and several were scattered about. This particular one purported to show the entire land. It had been painted, inked, embroidered, and gilded onto the skin of a large animal, and it had quite a lot to say. When she'd been younger, Prim had stared at it for hours. It appeared that one of the Bufrects had somewhat rashly ventured an opinion, and that Prim was summoning all of her self-restraint to remain civil while setting him straight. Brindle, having arrived a little too late to finesse the situation, was helpless to do anything but stand by and nod as Prim launched into it, thus. The land was shaped long before El came into it, and it was shaped by Egdod. He started here, in what is now the middle, where El's palace now stands atop its pillar. Perhaps this is why you are confused, and flew generally east. Following the great river, creating it as he went more like, until it had grown so wide that he felt it ought to empty into something. He marked that place with an enormous rock on the south bank, and then began to fly north, keeping the sea to his right, and creating the shore to his left. About here, Prim pulled an arrow from her quiver and used it to point to a broad, steady curve that formed the northeastern extremity of the land. Egdod thought better of making the land any more enormous than it already was, and swept gradually round until he was flying west, which he did for a long time, which is why the generally straightish northern coast of the land, which stretches on for such a vast distance, is known as the Back Hall. Oh, said Mardelian Bufrect. To me, that was always just a word. It never crossed my mind that it was based on anything. Back Hall. He cleared his throat and blushed slightly. Then, in what he apparently thought was a more authoritative voice, he added, Pray continue. He exchanged a glance with his kinsman, Anvaline. With your entertaining tale. Mard and Line, as they were generally called, grinned at each other, a detail Prim did not notice, as she was shifting round to the map's northwest corner. Weaver, sitting on a rock nearby, going through her damp things, shot her most peevish look at the two young men. Burr still appeared to be sleeping. Corvus was hopping about the place, showing his usual complete lack of interest in what the humans were talking about. If the map was considered the splayed skin of a dead animal, with its butt end pointed due east, then Prim had come round to its right foreleg, the northwest quadrant. Lacking any means of judging distance, she continued, Egdod overshot the palace considerably, which is why as much of the land lies to the west of it as to the east. The second bending hereabouts is where he decided to turn south again. It doesn't look the least bit like the first bending, pointed out Line, in a tone of voice meant to indicate he was having none of it, and just humoring Prim as a sort of private game with Mardelian. It's just a mess of islands with channels between them. That mess of islands, the Bits and Shivers, is your home, and Kala is the largest of the bits, Prim scolded him. And it wasn't thus when Egdod made it. It and the first bending used to be as symmetrical as a pair of shoulders. Mardelian seized on this pretext to gaze at Prim's shoulders, as if he needed a flesh-and-blood model in order to fully grasp her meaning. The whole region west of the river, west of where Second L-Town now lives, here, snapped off. Snapped off? Gradually, as big things move slowly, said Prim, sensing a bit of weakness in her own position. So the big channel here, the first shiver, which used to be a river, is the widest, and you can't see all the way across it except in some places. This whole chunk that broke off just happened to contain most of the wild souls and the giants. Line sighed. So much talk of giants in all the old stories, yet I have never seen one. You see them all the time. You will see one tomorrow, croaked Corvus, if you will only shut up and accept your fate as a two-footed thing, namely, to walk. Brindle broke the awkward silence. A game we used to play, looking at this map, was to think of all the little islands among the Shivers as if they were shards of a broken pot, then try to mentally imagine how they could be reassembled. Anvaline and Mardelian exchanged a look. They seemed uneasy with Brindle's proposing that any activity so tedious could be categorized as a game. If you look at them for long enough, you can see how an indentation in one bit's coastline matches a protuberance in the coast of the bit facing it across the shiver, Brindle insisted. Shiver was the local term for a channel running between bits, or in the case of the first shiver, between the bits and the mainland. Meanwhile, Prim had skirted around behind Brindle to the southwest, or the dead animal's left foreleg. This was conveniently occupied by a peninsula that reached for some distance out into the sea. Before turning inward again, Egdod asked himself how far the ocean might extend, and stuck out south and west for some considerable distance until he became bored with it, which is why we call this arm of the land the Asking, and the prominence at the end of it, Cape Boredom. Huh, said Line, in spite of himself. Boredom. I never put that together. But after satisfying himself that the ocean was quite limitless, and mindful of his responsibilities back in First Town, Egdod turned back and flew east, headed generally back toward the huge rock that he had set up to mark the outlet of the great river. It was a long journey, as you can see. He grew weary of flying in a straight line and began turning this way and that, and ever since, this series of gulfs and peninsulas that complicate the land's southern coastline, so different from the back haul, has been known as the Turnings, exclaimed Mard. Another of those funny old words. The largest of these Egdod later enlarged into the Central Gulf, but in due course he spied the big rock where his circumnavigation had begun and made his way to it, throwing in lots of picturesque headlands and cliffs here along the southeastern corner, as he sensed it was his last opportunity to use up his best ideas before he got to the end. And that is why the land has the shape that it does. It's nothing to do with L. I heard he got a lot wrong, though, said Mard. Line shot him a look. I mean, even people who believe in the old songs and tales say as much. He said that for the benefit of Weaver, who had begun fussing with her harp, an instrument that was nearly impossible to tune even when it was bone dry. She was older than Prim, and seemed to have devoted most of her years to memorizing stories and ballads. When her harp was in working order, which actually was not that often, she would sing them with enough conviction to make everyone present believe that they were true recitals of the facts. Sensing that the others were looking her way, Weaver shrugged. Oddly enough, she always seemed a little bewildered when she found herself the center of attention. It would be a sign of great learning to be able to recite all the tales of Egdod and Pluto. I know only a small portion of them, and yet could devote an entire evening to the telling of stories in that vein. "And she will if we sit still for it," said Lion. "It's easy for fault-finders to come along thousands of years later and say that Egdod shouldn't have made Pluto's job so difficult," said Prim. "But that's nothing like claiming that El made the entire land. Why, that's just rubbish." "But the pinnacle, the palace, the hive," Lion said, and he made a quick glance over his shoulder, roughly eastward, and bowed slightly at the waist. Even though they were too far away to see the palace, this was a common gesture among persons who were inclined to take El's side of things. Mard belatedly did the same. The others, Brindle, Prim, and Weaver, glanced east, but omitted the bowing part of it. Burr jerked in his sleep. Corvus flapped his wings irritably. "Those are places, yes, where El changed things dramatically," Brindle admitted. "But even the most fervent priests of El accept the notion that Egdod started it all. It works in their favor, actually, since whenever they notice something about the land that seems ungainly or cack-handed, they can blame it on Egdod." "I know," Lion admitted. "It's just that it all seems a bit made up." "What do you mean, made up?" "Egdod flying about and putting this here and that there, and Pluto cleaning up after him." "Make this up, stripling," shouted Corvus in a voice even more strangled and cacophonous than the norm. They all turned toward the boulder where he was perching and saw a man. A naked man enrobed in long black hair and a long black beard with beady black eyes. His skin was ochre, and his nails long and yellowed and talon-like. He was sitting on his haunches. His beard dangled down between his legs and concealed the place where one would expect to see a penis. The mountain breeze was whipping his hair around his face, only his eyes burning through the blur. "Oh, my goodness," Brindle said. "Where did he come from?" Lion asked, looking around for a weapon. "And where's the bird?" Burr levered himself up to his full height, which was considerable, using his spear. It didn't take long for him to notice the strange naked man on the rock. He took a step in that direction and brought the spear's tip down to bear on the intruder. "I think he is the bird, Lion," Mard said. Weaver had set her harp aside and stood up. She was fascinated. She'd sidestepped over Burr's way and rested a hand on the socket of his spearhead, just behind the glinting leaf-shaped blade, and pushed it gently aside. "Singing of this, and actually seeing it, are very different things," she said. Prim stood still through all of this, gazing into the man's eyes. "It's you," she concluded. "It's still Corvus." "Now that I have your attention," Corvus announced, but then he gagged, hacked, and spat, as if having some difficulty learning to use the new vocal apparatus. When he had recovered, he went on in a somewhat deeper and more human tone. "There'll be no more wanky chatter about such topics during the quest." He hawked up a little more and spat it in the general direction of the map. "Now roll that thing up, and don't take it out anymore. What the hell are you doing wasting your time looking at the map when the world itself is spread out all around you?" And with that his glossy black hair and beard wrapped themselves around his body and came together to coat all of his face save his eyes and his nose, and the nose and jaw extended and hardened into a beak. His feet shrank, and his toes lengthened into talons. There was a lot of unsightly twitching and spasming, and vocalization that caused everyone except Weaver to avert their gaze. Mardelian even clapped his hands over his ears, and Prim had to step lively as the creature voided its bowels in mid-transformation. Then it was just Corvus again. He made 2 experimental hops and then took to the air. The other 6 members of the party all looked at one another, just to confirm that this had really happened. Prim was still clutching the arrow she had been using as a pointer. She put it back into its quiver, then dropped to one knee at the eastern edge of the map. Before she began to roll it up again, she took one long last look at it, the way you do at an old friend before you set out on a long journey without them. Burr had never unpacked. He was already good to go. Turning his broad back on the way they'd come, he gazed down the pass. The convolutions of the valleys below beguiled him for a while, but after a bit he picked out a plausible-seeming direction and indicated it with his spear. Then he looked at Corvus and raised his eyebrows. "Ugh, more," Prim blurted, as they came round yet another bend in the valley. For she'd been hoping that this time it would be different, and they would see open country, green pastures, a giantess looking after her beasts. Is this what it is, or was, like to be Pluto? Brindle, who was ahead of her, turned his head in profile, frowning. Then he seemed to understand, or perhaps he was merely humoring her, and he smiled and turned back to the next rock, the next footfall. "I mean," Prim went on, "is it the case that Egdod said, 'I want a valley here with mountains at the top and at the bottom a river emptying into the sea,' and then flew on in the satisfaction of a job well done, and then Pluto came along later and shaped each individual rock and thought about where to set it down?" She feigned a yawn. "Oh, the previous 2,000 rocks were all set in place rather firmly. I do believe I'll balance this one, just so, to trip up an inattentive traveler who might happen along a few eons from now." She looked back at Burr to make sure he'd noticed the rock in question. As usual, he was paying more attention to the heights around them than to the ground in front of the shaggy mucklucks that for him served as boots. But he had a third leg in the form of his spear and fell no more often than anyone else. Occasionally he would stop and shush them all, and in the silence they would hear the cry of an animal echoing from the cliffs that hemmed in the valley, or see a little cascade of stones dribbling down from a vantage point. Anvaline was ahead of her at the moment, for he and Maudelian tended to grow bored and dawdle and fall behind, whereupon Burr would grow stormy-looking, and Brindle, noting as much, would yell at them, and then they would come racing down pell-mell and run on ahead until Burr and Brindle checked them. Line turned half around and said, "According to Weaver's stories, Pluto didn't make all of this anyway." Weaver got the hunched, furtive look she always did when someone was trying to draw her into the conversation, and scuttled on ahead, leaving Prim to answer, "Of course he did." "What I'm saying," Line replied, "is that in those stories this all snapped off and got redone after Pluto and the rest had been flung into the sky and got rid of. So maybe if you don't like the way these rocks are set down, you should complain to Edda. When, and if we actually see her. No soul went to the trouble to shape these rocks one by one, as a baker's hand shapes a loaf," Corvus ruled, banking slowly over their heads on a cool breeze coming up the valley. "Then how did they come to be here?" Prim asked, "with the shapes that they have?" "Why, when you step wrong, do you fall down?" Corvus replied. "The land is so constituted that it has laws, which all things heed without the need for souls to observe, think, act, and do other soul-like things. So everything falls. Fall simply is. And besides fall, there are other such laws and tendencies. Hill giants, maybe, are aware of the slow forces that splinter cliffs and shape rocks, but not the likes of us." "So maybe Edda will have something to say about it," Mard put in. He was only joking, as Prim could tell by the look he threw Line. But if Corvus understood it as a jest, he had no patience for it. "If I see one more of you ground-pounders craning your necks and scanning the skyline for a glimpse of her kneecap, I'll croak," he exclaimed. "Attend to the rocks. It won't be much longer." But it was much longer, and so after a while Prim took up the theme again. She had a hidden motive. These debates made the time go by faster, and kept Line and Mard nearer the rest of the group. Prim required further convincing. "I have not seen the palace," she began. "I have," said Corvus. "But I have seen many depictions of it, and heard it described in the songs of Weaver, and if there is any truth in those, it perches on a spire of rock that is so tall and slender, it cannot answer to the same laws that, according to you, govern this. And after a brief pause to be sure of her footing, she looked up and spread her arms to indicate the cliffs all around them. It is an exception, to be sure, Corvus admitted. It was so shaped in the before times, Weaver assured them, when there were many such prodigies that could never be brought into being today. It was the last such, and some say that in making it, Egdot spent his powers and made himself too weak to overcome the usurper. This last word she spoke quietly, in confidence to Prim, for it was a forbidden word, not safe to say aloud in certain company. But Prim took no note, for as she had raised her gaze just now from the next rock and the next, she had spied, around the next bend in the valley, a patch of blue sky above a field of green. "You have to understand," Corvus remarked, as the party lengthened its strides into Edda's valley, "that being a giant or a giantess is not about being giant, or even large. That's just a common misconception." Marden Line turned back to gawp at him. They simply could not believe the things Corvus said sometimes. "People have got impossibly confused," Corvus went on, "because of hill giants and other wild souls, who actually are unbelievably enormous. Edda has a form like ours." Line was beyond exasperated, ready to turn on his heel and walk home, it seemed. Then why denote her as a giantess? He threw a look at Weaver, as if it were her fault. "For hell's sake, can't we come up with a different term?" "First children of Eve are known by many names, if you only listen with care to the old songs," said Weaver. "Angel Eaters, Adam's Woe, Cairn's Care." "Fine," Line snapped. "All better names than giantess." Burr had stopped a few hundred paces short of a cottage that they had all, without discussing it, been heading for since it had hove into view. Until recently they had been traversing wolfish country, where even the creatures that weren't wolves tended to come equipped with a remarkable array of horns, tusks, and claws. In such places Burr liked to advance to the head of the group. Brindle liked to bring up the rear. Remarks he'd made along the way suggested he was afraid of being attacked from behind by unspecified creatures who, or so it could be guessed, were extraordinarily quiet in their movements and patient in their approach to hunting. But there hadn't been much excitement so far. Everything that had come at them had done so from the front and found itself on the wrong end of Burr's spear. A few times Prim had taken up her bow and knocked an arrow just in case, but not let any fly. At no point during even the most thrilling encounters had Burr actually shown signs of excitement or exhibited the least reluctance to keep forging ahead, and so it was strange that he now stopped, in an open space with no wild beasts of any kind in evidence and no obstructions. A stone's throw away off to their left, a couple of mounts were eating grass, bending their necks to crop it from the ground, and then bobbing back up to eye them curiously as they chewed. "No walls, really," Burr pointed out. "No weapons. Livestock out in plain sight. Unafraid." "Yes, indeed," Mart said. "It seems very safe." "Why?" Brindle asked. Rhetorically. That's what Burr is asking himself. Mardelian hadn't considered that angle. Neither had Prim. "Well," Mard guessed, "you know, we haven't seen what's inside the cottage yet." "Bread baking, to judge from the fragrance," Prim said. "It could be full of armed autochthons." "It's not," said Brindle, and nodded at Burr. The man-at-arms, after giving the cottage only a quick look, had turned his back on it, and was now surveying the sweep of dark hills that enclosed the valley, and the pair of snow-capped peaks at its head, between which they had passed yesterday. "You see," Brindle began, but Line, impatient with the lesson, cut him off. "We've been making our way through her defenses ever since we came down the pass and spotted that wolf up on the ridgeline staring at us." "We're surrounded?" Mardelian asked. Burr reversed his grip on the spear so that it became more walking stick than weapon. The party spread out to stroll across the pasture 7 abreast. On the left flank, the young men Anvaline and Mardelian, on loan from the clan Bufrecht. Then Weaver, who seemed to be vaguely attached to House Caledon. Brindle, its patriarch, walked in the middle. To his right was Prim. Well off to the right was Burr, who preferred to keep his spear arm free of flesh and blood obstructions. In the open space between him and Prim, Corvus hopped along, occasionally flying for short bursts when he fell behind, or needed to clear one of the stone walls that divided the pastures. In spite of Corvus's words, Prim had been holding out for something in a gigantic vein. But as they drew closer to the cottage, it became undeniable that it was in no way of unusual size. Not cramped for certain, and of a somewhat rambling character, as bits had been added on from time to time. One could make out foundation stones of wings that did not exist anymore. These erupted from the ground like rows of teeth from gums. Those must have been relics of ancient sections of the cottage that Edda had built, lived in for a time, and got rid of, or simply allowed to disintegrate with the passage of time. She wasn't tiny, at least. She opened the door to greet them, and was revealed to be about as tall as Burr. Her hair was white, full and long, braided down her back. She wore an apron streaked with flour, which she took this opportunity to give a brisk shake. The breeze caught the loose flour and bore it gently away. The flour caught the light as it drifted, and beguiled Prim's eye, for the shape that it took, and the manner of its movement, was just like that of clouds in the sky when they drifted overhead on a summer's day. This impression was so strong that it seized her mind entirely for a few moments, during which she could think of nothing save various times in her past life when she had gazed out her window or lain in the grass looking up at clouds. She did not entirely return to the here and now until she found herself some moments later standing, along with the others, right in the forecourt of the cottage, gazing up at the face of Edda. Or actually not gazing up, since Edda wasn't that tall, yet it felt up. Corvus, perched on the roof over the door, was doing the introducing, poking his long beak at each of them in turn and squawking out their name. Edda favored each of them with a look and, not a smile exactly, but an openness about the face that put one at ease, somewhat as a pure and unfeigned smile might. "Primula," she said, as if she'd heard of Prim. "How do you do?" Prim said back up to her, but again not really up. She got lost then in the striations in the iris of Edda's left eye. These were immensely complex and of all colors, having about them the same balance of order and wildness as exposed tree roots, tendrils of smoke in the wind, tongues of wild flame, the swirling of water where rivers came together. Prim wondered if the striations in her own irises were anywhere near as complicated. She guessed that the answer was probably no, and then wondered how such things got shaped in the first place. Were you just born with them, or did they grow in complexity over time? Or was it different when you were a giantess? Had Edda consciously worked on hers, or had they just taken form on their own? "Weaver," Edda said. Somehow they'd all entered the cottage and found seats around a table. A loaf of warm bread was there. They'd been tearing hunks from it and eating heartily, but there was plenty of bread remaining. Prim had got lost staring into the structure of a bread hunk, somewhat as she'd once sat for hours staring at the map of the land. There was a lot to this bread, and biting chunks out of it only exposed more. Steam escaped from the tiny round cavities and came together in roiling cloudlets shaped like flowers, men, and monsters, until she began to notice them, whereupon they undid themselves and became invisible currents of scent. Weaver had been lost in admiration of the tabletop, which was an enormous slab of polished stone, a handspan in thickness, supported at the ends by boulders founded in the earth. The floorboards, unable to bear such weight, had been carefully cut around them. The stone had complex patterns, and you could see some distance into it, as if it were part crystal. Hearing her name spoken, Weaver tore her gaze from this only to get distracted by Edda's braid, which the giantess had flipped to the front so that it trailed down over her bosom. There was a lot more to it than just a simple 3-strand braid. Yes, my lady? I have not had the pleasure of your company since 237 years ago, when you sat just where you are sitting now, and I taught you the lay of Aliscara and Blair. Prim remembered that vaguely. Two lovers who, as a side effect of a war between a hill giant and a troop of angels, had found themselves on opposite sides of a freshly made shiver. Before they could find a way across, Blair had become embroiled in a fight with some beetles, who had put him in chains and taken him away to a castle or something, where autochthons put him in a dungeon. Aliscara still walked on the cliff-top awaiting his return, so that at least was familiar. But Weaver's being at least 2.5 centuries old was news to her, and apparently to Brindle. Evidently it was even news to Weaver. That may very well be, my lady, but you have no recollection of it, for you must have passed on at least once since then. One would think so, said Weaver. The lion raised his face out of his bread hunk just long enough to gaze across the table at Mard, with a look that said, "No wonder she knows so many fucking songs." Before you leave, I shall teach you more, Etta promised. That would be a high honor. Not going to happen, Corvus announced from his perch on the sill of a window that Etta, perhaps unadvisedly, had left wide open. There's to be no leaving. You're coming with us. For the first time, Etta smiled. She turned her attention to Brindle and Prim, who were seated next to each other. You two are as father and daughter, she observed. But that is not so? Brindle shook his head. Her father and mother passed on, more than likely. Oh, it happened some time ago. She chose to remain a girl for many years, and I saw no point in rushing her along. Wise, Etta said. Dough given more time to rise makes a finer loaf. Then to Prim, you make a fine young woman, which means you chose correctly. Prim blushed and fell into a reverie, listening to the tones of Etta's voice, but not at all following the words. Her voice was as complex as her braid, and its strands were flutes, birdsong, and the lapping of waves on a lakeshore in the still of the evening. Brindle was squeezing her arm under the table. She looked at him. He inclined his head toward their hostess, whose last sentence rushed into her mind all at once. The giantess had said, I see from the calluses on your fingers that you like archery. I could teach you what little I know of flint-knapping. That is most generous, Prim said. The heads of my arrows are all forged. Much more practical, Etta said, but stone ones have their uses too. Learning that will burn weeks, Corvus protested. Think hours. Etta didn't seem to hear the giant talking raven. She turned her attention to the others, each in their turn. She remembered Burr as a warrior who had once passed on gloriously in single combat with an angel. This revelation certainly caused Lion and Mard to look at the spearman in a new light. Those two Bufrecht boys came in for examination next. Their clan lived round the edges of a steep rocky peninsula projecting from the southern end of Calla. It pointed into a broad, short shiver that connected straight to the ocean. So they were seagoing folk. They joined the quest on a lark, not without one or two swift kicks in the arse from their matriarch Paralanda. Since then, during wetter, colder, duller moments, they'd made no secret of regretting it. But by the time Etta was done talking to them, it was clear there'd be no more second thoughts. You make questing sound grand, Corvus pointed out. Perhaps setting foot out of this valley every few centuries would do you good. Brindle was the only one of the visitors Etta had not chatted with yet, and so it seemed natural he'd be next. But instead he and Etta merely looked at each other, arriving at some wordless understanding. Food had made them all sleepy, and so at Etta's invitation they spread out into various rooms of the cottage. For a small place it hid an extraordinary number of nooks and, as it were, backwaters, always surprising the visitor as she came round a corner. Before long Prim had found the perfect one for her, curled up in it, and fallen asleep. She rose once in the middle of the night to go outside and empty her bladder, and as she went in and out she overheard Etta and Brindle conversing in low tones, but could make out only a single word, which was spring. After that she slept very soundly. She had a dream in which radiant light was shining down from the palace, and she could not escape its glare, which penetrated even her closed eyelids. She was down on the ground far below, prostrate, but through the earth she could feel, more than hear, a deep grinding, as though the underpinnings of the land itself were being invisibly reshaped. This was not the pick-and-shovel work of beetles toiling under the lash, but something that hearkened to the before times, and the doings of Thingor. Standing up and turning her back to the light, she found herself gazing up into mountains, black at the base, white with snow above that, but hidden at the top behind storm clouds that reached up into the sky as high as El's pinnacle, wreathed at the top with blue lightning. She opened her eyes and flung out a hand to brace herself. In her dream, she had been standing on a grassy plain, but in fact she was lying on her side, back turned to the light of the morning, which was cutting in under the clouds and coming in straight through a window. That had been real, at least. The pinnacle and the storm had been dream figments, but that deep grinding sound was certainly there, pervading the cottage and coming up into her bones through the floor. She got up. The sound had a directionless quality that made finding its source no easy task, but soon enough she found her way into the kitchen. At the other end, by the door to a pantry that looked bigger than the rest of the house put together, a stone rested atop another stone. Both were round and flat, like thick coins or slices of a sausage. Their diameter was about the length of a person's arm. The one on top had a hole in its center, which was full of golden grain. Edda was standing next to it, one hand resting on the upper stone, and she was pushing it round and round. Flour trickled from a hole in the lower stone and collected in a bowl on the floor. This was, in other words, a mill like any other, save it lacked the water wheel or the team of beasts that would normally be required to budge anything so heavy. Edda moved it as easily as if it were a spinning wheel. "Is there some way I could help?" Prim asked. "It is about time to empty the bowl," Edda pointed out, and nodded at a large table in the middle of the kitchen on which a considerable heap of flour already stood. Prim stepped in, picked up the bowl, and carried it to the table, where she dumped it out atop what was already there. Then she paused for a few moments, for the shape of the heap was strikingly like that of the mountain in her dream, and the cloud of loose, airborne flour still swirling above it was like the thunderhead that obscured the heights. But she knew that the flour was spilling out onto the floor by the mill, so she hurried over and reinstated the bowl. While she was there kneeling at Edda's feet, she scooped up loose flour in her hands and transferred it into the bowl. The scent of flour was everywhere, of course, but so was the scent of Edda, which was faint but bottomless. "Baking more bread?" Prim asked, for it seemed that Edda had baked more than enough of it yesterday. "Hardtack," Edda corrected her, "to sustain us on the road."